My name is Doris Miller. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my career, I've been what companies like to call reliable. I work in municipal infrastructure budgeting in Portland, Oregon. On paper, I'm a senior financial analyst. In reality, I'm the person who notices when numbers breathe differently. Most people don't remember the person who reconciles the spreadsheets. They remember the charismatic project leads, the confident managers, the ones who present in tailored suits and speak in polished forecasts. I've always been the quiet one in the second row, the one who nods, the one who takes notes, the one who stays late without being asked. People often assume quiet means compliant, that if you don't interrupt, you don't understand. If you don't compete for air in a meeting, you must not need any. They've never realized that silence can also be observation. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontation or triumphant exposure. It's about something slower, more private. It's about the moment I realized that integrity can be lonely and dangerous. I caught my manager embezzling millions from the budget, not by accident, not through gossip, but because I was the one person who read every line item closely enough to notice when it didn't make sense. At first, it was just a pattern, a discrepancy, a rounding error that wasn't really a rounding error. Then I found the double entry books, and suddenly the woman everyone underestimated was holding information that could dismantle careers, including my own. I had to choose between my safety and the truth. There are moments in life when the loudest action you can take is restraint, when your power isn't in exposure, but in preparation, in patience, in understanding that truth has weight, and once released, it doesn't fall gently. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you what happened. Not with anger, not with theatrics, just honesty. I'll tell you who I was to them, how small compromises grow roots, how invisibility becomes leverage, and what it costs to decide that your integrity matters more than your comfort. If you've ever sat in a room knowing something wasn't right, but wondered whether speaking up would cost you everything, have you ever asked yourself what you would really do if silence felt safer than the truth? To them, I was dependable. That was the word used in my performance reviews. Dependable, consistent, thorough. Never visionary, never strategic leader, never indispensable, just dependable. In our department meetings, I sat 3 chairs from the end of the long walnut table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked when decisions were summarized. I prepared the pre-reads, I reconciled the variance reports, I caught arithmetic errors before they reached the director's desk. And when the presentations were delivered, my manager, Greg Halpern, stood at the front of the room and translated my spreadsheets into confident sound bites. No one questioned that arrangement. Greg was the kind of manager who filled space easily. Broad shoulders, easy laugh, cufflinks that suggested ambition. He shook hands as he meant it. He remembered birthdays. He also rarely remembered who built the financial frameworks he presented. But I never corrected him. Invisibility can feel like safety when you've learned that visibility attracts risk. When I was 12, my father reported procurement irregularities at the manufacturing plant where he worked. He believed policy protected him. It didn't. Within 6 months, he was restructured out. I remember the way he stared at the kitchen table after that, like truth had betrayed him. So I learned something early. Competence is safer than courage. If you do your work well enough, people rely on you. If you never challenge the hierarchy, they leave you alone. At the City Bureau, I became the person people forwarded problems to at 9:47 p.m., the one who fixed broken formulas quietly, the one who knew historical budget codes from 5 fiscal cycles ago. When new hires arrived, Greg would gesture toward me and say, "If you need numbers verified, Doris is your girl." Your girl. I was 38, but I smiled. I always smiled. Because correcting tone requires a certain appetite for friction, and I didn't have one, not outwardly. The truth is, I didn't mind being underestimated. Underestimation is camouflage. When people assume you lack ambition, they don't guard themselves around you. They speak freely, they forward emails without thinking twice. They CC you on threads they forget you can fully read. I became fluent in margins. I knew which projects were consistently overestimated and which ones quietly reallocated funds mid-quarter. I noticed how Greg liked to move discretionary buffers between line items, right before reporting deadlines. Nothing illegal, just strategic optics. At least, that's what I believed at the time. If someone had asked me then who I was in that office, I would have said, the stabilizer, the ballast that keeps the ship from tipping, not the captain. Never the captain. And yet, There is something about being the person who touches every number that slowly changes your relationship with power. You begin to understand that control doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it lives in the footnotes. They thought I was careful because I was timid. They didn't realize I was careful because I was watching. Looking back, I can see that my invisibility wasn't imposed. It was negotiated. I agreed to it. I chose it. Every time I let credit slide past me. Every time I softened a correction into a suggestion. Every time I told myself, this isn't worth the discomfort. I wasn't weak, but I was quiet. And quiet people in corporate environments are often mistaken for harmless. They were wrong. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a missing $1 million or a glaring fraud alert. It was a $42,800 discrepancy buried inside a routine capital improvement reconciliation. The kind of number that hides comfortably in a 9-figure municipal budget. I noticed it because I always notice remainders. The allocation for a bridge reinforcement project had been increased mid-quarter. That wasn't unusual. Weather delays, steel cost fluctuations, adjustments happen. But the vendor code attached to the adjustment didn't match the approved contractor. It matched a consulting firm I didn't recognize. When I flagged it in the internal tracking sheet, I didn't escalate it. I walked down the hallway to Greg's office and knocked lightly on the open door. He was on a call, leaning back in his chair, shoes on the edge of his desk. When he saw me, he held up one finger. I waited. After he hung up, I stepped in and placed the printed reconciliation on his desk, pencil resting along the margin. There's a vendor code mismatch on line 47, I said calmly. It looks like the adjustment was routed through Stratcore Advisory instead of Halbrook Engineering. He barely glanced at the paper. Yeah, he said, waving his hand dismissively. That's intentional. Stratcore is handling some supplementary oversight. Was that approved through procurement? I asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Doris, not everything needs to be a compliance seminar. It's covered. Covered. The word settled in my chest. I nodded. Okay, I'll annotate it for audit trail clarity. He leaned forward then, resting his elbows on the desk. You don't need to annotate everything. Sometimes flexibility keeps projects moving. It was subtle. The message wasn't hostile. It was corrective. I was being gently reminded of my place. The reliable one, not the policy interpreter. I left his office and returned to my desk. I stared at the line item again. The number hadn't changed, but something inside me had. I added a note anyway, not accusatory, just factual. Vendor code updated per management directive. Approval documentation pending. No one commented on it. A week later, during our team meeting, Greg referenced the bridge project's strategic oversight realignment, as if it had always been part of the plan. He didn't mention my question. He didn't mention the rerouting. And no one asked. That was the first small cut. Not the discrepancy itself, but the dismissal. It would have been easy to let it go. In fact, that's exactly what I told myself to do. Managers make executive adjustments all the time. You don't see every layer. You're not in every meeting. I rationalized it carefully, but I also opened a private folder on my encrypted drive that night. I titled it Variance Supplemental, not because I believed something criminal was happening, but because I didn't like the word covered. Over the next month, small adjustments like that appeared again. Different projects, different vendors, always routed through unfamiliar consulting entities. Always just under thresholds that would trigger automatic secondary review. Each time I brought it up gently. Each time I received some variation of the same answer. It's handled. Executive discretion. Don't overcomplicate it. No one else seemed bothered. In meetings, when I would begin to clarify a figure, Greg would finish my sentence for me, slightly altered, slightly reframed. It was subtle, a soft override, and people laughed when he did it, like it was efficient teamwork. That's how normalization begins, not with a scandal, with a pattern of minor dismissals. The kind that teaches you your precision is inconvenient, the kind that tests whether you'll shrink to fit the room. I didn't shrink, but I did go quiet. And when a quiet person stops asking questions out loud, it doesn't mean they've stopped asking them entirely. It just means the questions have moved somewhere safer. Disrespect rarely arrives as an insult. It arrives as efficiency. After the third vendor reroute, I stopped walking printed reconciliations down the hallway. I sent emails instead. Clear subject lines, neutral tone, specific references. Greg's replies grew shorter. Approved. Already discussed. Proceed. Sometimes he didn't reply at all. He would simply adjust the master file before I could log the variance note, which meant the system recorded him as the editor of record. It was subtle, but I noticed. In meetings, something else began to shift. When I clarified numbers, Greg would interrupt, not sharply, but with a kind of polished impatience. What Doris means, he'd say, smiling at the room, is that we've optimized the allocation structure. Optimized, not rerouted, not redirected. Optimized. The room would nod, the director would move on, and I would sit back, hands folded over my mechanical pencil, feeling the strange weight of being translated inaccurately. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. The budget is still balanced. The projects move forward. But language matters in finance. Words determine audit trails. Words shape liability. And slowly, I realized something uncomfortable. My precision was being softened into ambiguity. I rationalized it the way quiet professionals do. Maybe this is how leadership works. Maybe I'm too rigid. Maybe I don't understand the political layer. That's the dangerous thing about being conscientious. You assume the error begins with you. The vendor names kept appearing: Stratcore Advisory, Northbridge Analytics, Ellington Civic Solutions. None of them had substantial procurement histories with the city prior to this fiscal year. Their contracts were structured just below mandatory public review thresholds. Each time I raised a clarifying question, I was met with reassurance. You worry too much, Doris. You're paid to verify numbers, not question strategy. That one stayed with me. Paid to verify numbers, no question strategy. It was the first time I felt the boundary line drawn so clearly. Verification without interpretation. Observation without inference. I began to see my role as they saw it, a stabilizing function, a human calculator with institutional memory, useful, replaceable, invisible, and yet something inside me resisted shrinking, not outwardly. Outwardly, I remained composed. I delivered reports early, I stayed agreeable, I even stopped asking certain questions in meetings. But internally, I adjusted. If my questions were inconvenient in public, I would ask them in private. If my annotations were erased, I would archive previous versions before submission. If edits were made without comment, I would screenshot timestamps. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just carefully. There's a moment in professional life when you realize respect is not being withheld accidentally. It's being managed, calibrated. You are given just enough affirmation to remain productive, but not enough authority to disrupt hierarchy. Greg wasn't cruel. That's what made it complicated. He was personable. He complimented my thoroughness in front of upper management. He brought pastries on Fridays. He asked about my mother's knee surgery, but he also redirected six-figure adjustments without documentation. And when I gently pressed for paper trails, he looked at me like I was slowing him down. The normalization happened gradually. Interruptions became routine. Clarifications became unnecessary. Precision became overthinking. And because nothing overtly hostile occurred, no one else noticed. That's how environments train you. They don't silence you directly. They reward you for choosing silence yourself. I remember one afternoon, staring at my reflection in the darkened window after most of the office had left. The city lights blurred behind the glass. My desk lamp illuminated the spreadsheets in front of me. I asked myself a question I hadn't asked in years. If you already see the pattern, why are you pretending you don't? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about the trajectory. And the numbers were beginning to move in a direction I couldn't rationalize anymore. Every workplace assigns roles that don't appear in job descriptions. Mine wasn't senior financial analyst. It was a buffer. I absorbed pressure before it reached leadership. When deadlines compressed, I stayed late so Greg could leave early for external strategy dinners. When external auditors requested documentation, I assembled it in binders so clean they looked ceremonial. When council members questioned projections, I recalibrated models overnight so the numbers would align with whatever narrative had already been presented. Reliable, calm, non-confrontational, safe. At some point, I realized I wasn't being excluded from higher-level decisions because I lacked capability. I was being excluded because inclusion would complicate things. I asked precise questions. I tracked footnotes. I remembered last year's justifications word for word. That kind of memory makes people uncomfortable when their stories shift. The shift became clearer during a quarterly executive briefing. Greg presented a reallocation strategy that moved nearly $3.2 million across infrastructure categories. It was bold, confident, forward-thinking. It was also structured around consulting disbursements that had bypassed competitive review. As he spoke, slides flickered behind him, slides I had built. But I noticed something subtle. A column I had labeled Pending Authorization Documentation had been renamed Expedited Compliance Processing. Expedited. I hadn't used that word. After the meeting, I approached him quietly in the hallway. That terminology adjustment, I said evenly. It implies documentation exists. It will, he replied without slowing his stride. You're good at making sure of that. That was the moment I understood the role I had been assigned. Not just buffer, validator. My diligence was being used as a future shield. My reputation for precision created the assumption that everything beneath his leadership had already been vetted. He didn't need to forge approvals. He only needed people to assume I had seen them. The realization wasn't explosive, it was cold. I went back to my desk and opened the shared drive history. Document revisions, access logs, metadata trails, small fingerprints most people never examine. The consulting firms were linked through a parent LLC registered out of state. The authorization emails approving their expedited engagement came from Greg's account. But the compliance confirmation fields were marked reviewed. By me, except I had never clicked review. He had bulk applied the status after consolidating files. It was technically possible within his managerial permissions. Not illegal on its face, just convenient. I stared at the screen for a long time. This was the architecture. I wasn't being sidelined. I was being positioned. If scrutiny ever came, my name would be attached to the procedural checkpoints. Not because I signed them, but because the system reflected that I had touched the files. My quietness had made me ideal. No one questions the meticulous one. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not anger, clarity. They didn't see me as harmless. They saw me as useful. There's a difference. And once you understand the role you've been cast in, you have two choices. Continue performing it, or rewrite it silently. That afternoon, I took my mechanical pencil and wrote a single sentence in the margin of my notebook. Documentation protects truth. Silence protects timing. I didn't confront him. I didn't escalate. I didn't accuse. I adjusted, because if I were being positioned as the validator of decisions I didn't authorize, then I needed to understand the full structure before anyone realized I had. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday evening at 7:18 p.m., when the office had emptied and the air conditioning had switched to its quieter night cycle. I was alone. The city outside my window glowed in soft amber light. Traffic moved slowly across the bridge we had reinforced on paper months earlier. My desk lamp cast a small circle of clarity over the reconciliation file open on my screen. I wasn't searching for anything dramatic. I was following a pattern. Stratcore Advisory had received 4 separate disbursements across 3 unrelated projects. Each payment was approved under expedited oversight. Each invoice contained nearly identical language, consulting hours, strategic advisory alignment, and infrastructure optimization modeling. The phrasing was polished, too polished. I opened the vendor registration archive and cross-referenced business filings. Stratcore's listed address was a shared corporate suite in Delaware. Northbridge Analytics traced back to the same registered agent. Ellington Civic Solutions shared a mailing contact number with both. That's when something inside me went still. Not panicked. Still, I requested archived email metadata from the internal server, something I was authorized to access for audit preparation. I filtered by invoice attachment timestamps and cross-checked them against submission times. 3 invoices had been created within minutes of each other. Different companies, identical formatting, identical font irregularities, and then I saw it. A second ledger, not labeled that way, of course. It was titled Supplemental Tracking Executive Draft. It wasn't stored in the primary finance directory. It lived inside a restricted managerial subfolder that Greg rarely opened while others were present. I shouldn't have had access, but he had once temporarily granted me permissions during a reporting emergency and never revoked them. Inside that folder were mirrored entries, true allocation records. The numbers didn't align with the official budget sheets. Funds marked as consulting oversight in public-facing documents were redirected in the supplemental ledger to a holding entity. The total across 18 months exceeded $4.6 million. My hands didn't shake. They rested flat on the desk. I opened one more document, a wire transfer summary embedded within the supplemental file. The destination account belonged to an investment group I recognized from one of Greg's conference conversations. He had once mentioned diversifying civic partnerships. The phrasing returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. I caught my manager embezzling millions from the budget. The sentence formed slowly in my mind. It didn't feel cinematic, it felt administrative. Embezzling. I leaned back and closed my eyes. This wasn't misallocation. It wasn't an aggressive strategy. It wasn't executive discretion. It was deliberate duplication. Double entry books, one for public oversight, one for private extraction. The room felt smaller, not because I was afraid yet, but because knowledge compresses space. I understood something instantly. This wasn't a clerical irregularity that could be corrected with a memo. This was systemic, structured, sustained, and I was the only person who had both the access and the patience to see the entire pattern. That realization didn't make me powerful. It made me exposed. If I could see it, I could prove it. And if I could prove it, I would become a variable in the equation. I printed nothing. I forwarded nothing. I didn't even copy files that night. Instead, I logged out calmly, powered down my workstation, and placed my mechanical pencil back into its case. On the walk to my car, the air felt unusually crisp. The city looked the same. The bridge lights shimmered. People laughed outside restaurants. Life continued without awareness. Inside my mind, something irreversible had shifted. I no longer wondered whether something was wrong. I knew, and now I had to decide whether knowing was enough. Because once I acted, the silence that had protected me for years would no longer be neutral. It would become a choice. The morning after I found the supplemental ledger, I made coffee the same way I always did. Measured grounds, level scoop, no rush. There is a specific kind of discipline required when you are holding something volatile, and no one around you knows it exists. You cannot let your breathing change. You cannot let your routine shift. You cannot suddenly become vigilant in a way that attracts attention. At 8:32 a.m., I walked into the office and greeted the receptionist with the same tone I had used for years. Greg arrived 10 minutes later, carrying his gym bag and his confidence. "Morning, Doris," he said easily. "Need that revised allocation summary by noon?" "Of course," I replied. And I meant it. Silence at that point was no longer passive. It was strategic. I spent the morning completing my normal tasks. But beneath that, a second process was unfolding. I reviewed access permissions. I verified the audit trail retention period for internal servers. I reread the municipal whistleblower protection policy, not because I planned to invoke it immediately, but because I needed to understand its architecture. Protection is often procedural, not emotional. The policy outlined reporting channels: internal ethics office, external oversight committee, and state controller. It promised confidentiality. It promised non-retaliation. Policies also promised my father stability. I didn't feel cynical. I felt realistic. By mid-morning, Greg forwarded another invoice approval. Stratcor again, $186,000. Push through, his email read. Time sensitive. I stared at the number. This was how normalization works. Even after you see the truth, the machinery continues operating as if nothing has changed. The system assumes your compliance because it always had it. I approved nothing, but I didn't reject it either. Instead, I created a mirrored record, privately timestamped. I began documenting not just the discrepancies, but the sequence, dates, language patterns, behavioral shifts. Silence became structure. At lunch, I sat in the break room while two colleagues discussed vacation plans. I watched their ease, their unawareness, and I understood something sobering. Once this surfaced, it wouldn't just affect Greg. It would ripple. Funding freezes, project delays, public scrutiny, jobs destabilized. Truth is rarely surgical. It spreads. That realization forced me to confront the real question, not whether he was guilty. That was evident. The question was, what responsibility did I carry for the aftermath? When you hold evidence of corruption, you don't just hold proof of wrongdoing. You hold the potential to disrupt an ecosystem. And ecosystems resist disruption. Around 3 p.m., Greg stopped by my desk. "You've been quiet lately," he said lightly. I met his eyes. "Just focused." He nodded. "Good. That's why you're invaluable." Invaluable. The word almost made me smile. He thought my silence meant loyalty or fatigue or resignation. He didn't consider that silence can also mean assessment. By the end of the day, I had built a framework. Not for exposure, for preservation. Encrypted backups stored off-site. Version histories exported. Access logs are saved in chronological order. Nothing stolen, nothing altered. Just copies of what already existed. I found the double entry books. And now I had to choose between my safety and the truth. But choice doesn't require immediacy. It requires preparation. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my notebook and wrote 2 columns. On the left, if I report. On the right, if I don't. Both columns carried weight. Both carried cost. The difference was timing. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't fear. It was leverage. And leverage only works if you understand when to release it. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. For the next 6 weeks, I became even more predictable. I arrived at 8:30, I left at 6:15. I brought the same lunch twice a week. I corrected minor formula errors with the same calm precision I always had. No one suspects the person who behaves consistently. What they never noticed was that I had shifted from reactive analysis to forensic mapping. I wasn't just reconciling numbers anymore. I was reconstructing intent. Every consulting disbursement was cataloged chronologically. I built a private timeline that overlaid 3 layers: official ledger entries, supplemental ledger entries, and external transfer confirmations. When viewed separately, each layer appeared defensible. When layered together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. The transfers were paced strategically, never exceeding thresholds that triggered automatic review. Amounts were split across departments that rarely coordinated with each other. The consulting firms invoiced just below the caps, requiring counsel acknowledgement. It wasn't reckless. It was engineered. I studied behavioral rhythms too. Greg tended to submit high-value adjustments on Fridays after 4 p.m. He preferred long holiday weekends for multi-entry reclassifications. He often followed up with warm, personable messages on Monday morning, reinforcing team morale after significant financial shifts. Charm as insulation. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting emotionally. There was no outrage in my documentation, no accusatory language, just neutral descriptors. Entry divergence, mirrored ledger variance, authorization anomaly. Emotion clouds credibility, precision sharpens it. I also began researching external structures. The holding entity receiving funds was tied to a private investment partnership registered under layered LLCs. I didn't hack anything. I didn't trespass beyond legal access. I used public filings, cross-referenced addresses, and compared incorporation dates. The consulting firms had been established within 3 months of each other. Their registered agent had previously dissolved 2 unrelated shell companies after short operational windows. It was a system designed to rotate. I never accessed files outside my authorization. I never copied original data from restricted directories without existing permissions. Every document I archived was one I could legally view as part of audit preparation. If anyone ever questioned my access history, it would reflect normal workflow patterns. That was intentional. Quiet dominance isn't about exposure. It's about insulation. Meanwhile, Greg's behavior toward me subtly shifted. He became slightly more performative in meetings, more inclined to publicly credit me for excellent oversight. At first, I wondered if he sensed something, but I realized something else. He felt secure. My continued compliance validated his assumptions. One afternoon, he invited me to join a strategic planning session with senior leadership, something I'd never been included in before. He introduced me as the most meticulous analyst in the bureau. I observed the room carefully. They trusted him, completely. And because they trusted him, they trusted the systems beneath him, including me. That's when I understood the magnitude of the decision ahead. If I brought this forward improperly, I wouldn't just accuse a manager. I would destabilize confidence in the entire budgeting framework. If I stayed silent, the extraction would continue. Each option carried collateral consequences, so I refined my preparation further. I scheduled a routine audit readiness review with the internal compliance office. Nothing alarming, just proactive. I asked procedural questions about documentation retention standards. I clarified reporting channels hypothetically. I never mentioned Greg. I never mentioned embezzlement. I simply ensured I understood the landscape. At home, my evenings became structured. I created encrypted backups stored in a secure cloud vault under neutral naming conventions. I wrote a factual summary of findings, no conclusions, just observations. I included dates, file paths, approval stamps, and vendor registration cross-references. If something happens to me professionally, the documentation would still exist. Not as a threat, as continuity. They never noticed the shift in my posture. They never noticed that my questions had become fewer, but sharper. They never noticed that I had stopped correcting Greg in meetings altogether, because I no longer needed to. The evidence was building itself. By the end of those 6 weeks, I had reconstructed 18 months of financial diversion with enough clarity that an external auditor could follow it without my narration. And yet I hadn't reported it. Not because I was afraid, because timing determines impact. There is a difference between knowing the truth and knowing when to release it. I was no longer gathering proof. I was calculating consequence, and soon calculation would no longer be enough. Clarity doesn't arrive as triumph. It arrives as a quiet confirmation. The private reveal wasn't the moment I found the supplemental ledger. That was discovery. This was understanding. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during a routine cross-department reconciliation call. Transportation, utilities, public works. We reviewed quarterly alignment before the external reporting cycle. As each department summarized its spending, I watched something subtle unfold. Utilities had underreported a consulting allocation by $312,000 compared to the central ledger. Transportation's discretionary oversight line item showed a timing difference that exactly matched one of the mirrored supplemental entries I had documented. Individually, the discrepancies were explainable. Collectively, they synchronized. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct anyone. I muted my microphone and opened my layered timeline. There it was. The supplemental ledger wasn't just a parallel record. It was the master choreography. Official entries were being retrofitted to align after funds had already moved. Departments were unknowingly adjusting their summaries to reconcile distortions introduced upstream. They weren't complicit. They were compensating. That realization settled something inside me. Greg wasn't just redirecting funds. He was manipulating timing across multiple departments, so the aggregate reports would eventually balance, just not truthfully. He understood bureaucratic fatigue. He knew that when 3 departments each adjust small variances, no one zooms out far enough to see the composite shift, except for someone who lives in the composite. Me. After the call ended, I remained seated, staring at the numbers. I recalculated the total diversion across 18 months using conservative estimates, excluding any entries that lacked airtight cross-verification. The sum exceeded $5.2 million. Even if I removed the ambiguous transfers, the pattern held. I leaned back slowly. This was no longer a suspicion. It was structural embezzlement disguised as interdepartmental optimization. And I was the only person who could map it end-to-end without speculation. That's when the private reveal deepened. I opened the authorization logs again, not to confirm guilt, but to confirm vulnerability. Every bulk approval applied under my review category had a timestamp. Every timestamp correlated with periods when Greg had temporary control over shared file states, typically after I had submitted draft reconciliations but before final archival. He wasn't forging my signature. He was exploiting workflow sequencing. If investigated, the system would initially reflect that I had reviewed those entries, not because I clicked approval, because the metadata didn't distinguish between draft staging and finalized confirmation once bulk applied. For the first time, I felt the full architecture of risk. If I reported this without airtight preparation, I wouldn't just expose him. I would implicate myself in appearance. I found the double entry books, and now I had to choose between my safety and the truth. But safety wasn't binary. It wasn't just about job security. It was about reputation. In finance, credibility is currency. Once questioned, it rarely recovers fully, even if cleared. I imagined the narrative. Senior analyst involved in oversight of discrepancies. Procedural irregularities under her review category. Manager denies unilateral action. The ambiguity alone could stain a career. And yet, silence would mean complicity by endurance. That afternoon, I closed all files and walked to the restroom. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. My reflection looked the same, composed, neutral. No one could see the weight behind my eyes. I didn't feel anger toward Greg in that moment. I felt disappointment, not just in him, but in the system that allowed charm to outrun verification. When I returned to my desk, I drafted a document titled Independent Variance Summary, Preliminary Observations. No accusations, no conclusions, just structured cross-reference data with footnotes explaining methodology. If I ever released this, it would speak for itself. Quietly, I saved it to an encrypted drive. Then I did something else. I scheduled a personal consultation with an external employment attorney, not to file anything, not to threaten action, but to understand protection thresholds. Preparation without exposure. By the time I shut down my computer that evening, I knew something with complete certainty. This would not resolve itself. There would be no accidental discovery that absolved me of the decision. The truth was stable, documented, verifiable. Now the only unstable element was me. And stability, I've learned, is often mistaken for passivity. It isn't. It's controlled pressure. The decision didn't come from anger. It came from mathematics. I sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with 2 folders open in front of me. One contained 18 months of cross-reference documentation. The other contained printed excerpts of whistleblower statutes, municipal reporting protocols, and the notes from my consultation with the employment attorney. She had been calm, direct. If you move forward, she told me, you do it once, cleanly, with full documentation, no informal warnings, no partial disclosures, and you assume retaliation may not look dramatic, it may look administrative. Administrative retaliation, reassignment, performance scrutiny. isolation, reputation erosion. Nothing cinematic, just pressure. I respected that clarity. On the left side of my table, I wrote, Option 1, stay silent. Career stability, predictable income, complicity through endurance, ongoing diversion of public funds. On the right, Option 2, formal disclosure, professional risk, legal protection, conditional, reputational vulnerability, financial integrity restored, potentially. The word potentially mattered. There was no guarantee the system would act decisively. Investigations move slowly. Institutions protect themselves before they protect individuals. But I kept returning to one question. If I remain silent, who do I become? Not in public, in private. The money wasn't abstract. These were infrastructure funds, bridge maintenance, water treatment upgrades, public transit repairs. Every diverted dollar widened gaps somewhere else. I thought about my father again. Not the day he lost his job, but the years after. The quiet erosion of self-trust when he questioned whether speaking up had been worth it. I understood something I hadn't understood at 12. His regret wasn't that he told the truth. It was that he wasn't prepared for the aftermath. Preparation changes the outcome. I wasn't walking into this naively. I had documentation, I had legal counsel, I had a procedural understanding. I had preserved evidence in ways that protected the chain of custody. And most importantly, I had clarity. Greg would not stop voluntarily. The structure was too refined, too practiced. Silence would not neutralize the harm. It would compound it. That afternoon, I organized my files into a single encrypted archive with indexed references. I included timeline of ledger divergences, vendor registration crosslinks, metadata demonstrating a bulk approval application, transactional summaries with conservative calculations, a neutral narrative summary of findings. No speculation, no emotional language, just structure. Then I drafted a formal disclosure email addressed to the Internal Ethics Oversight Office with a request for confidential handling under whistleblower protection statutes. I did not send it immediately. Instead, I scheduled it for 8:07 a.m. Tuesday morning. Not Monday, too chaotic. Not late in the day, too easy to bury. Early enough that it would be logged before daily momentum began. Scheduling the email felt heavier than writing it, because once sent, the system would activate, and I would no longer control the pace. That night, I slept unexpectedly well. Decision relieves a certain kind of tension. I wasn't choosing heroism. I was choosing alignment. On Tuesday at 8:07 a.m., the email left my outbox. I watched the confirmation notice appear. Delivered. There was no dramatic sound, no immediate consequence. Just a timestamp. Irreversible. At 8:07 a.m., the email left my outbox. At 8:08, I closed the window and opened the quarterly variance spreadsheet like it was any other Tuesday. That was the discipline. If you expect an explosion, you telegraph anxiety. If you expect nothing, you appear unchanged. By 9:15, Greg had stopped by my desk. Morning, he said lightly. We'll need to finalize the utilities adjustment before council review. Understood, I replied. I watched him carefully, not for guilt, but for awareness. There was none. His tone was steady, his posture relaxed. The Ethics Oversight Office did not respond immediately. They weren't supposed to. The attorney had told me that formal intake often begins quietly. Metadata review, internal flagging, preliminary cross-checks before direct contact. Investigations don't announce themselves. They circulate. By midday, I noticed something subtle. 2 historical files I had archived months earlier were accessed by an administrative account not typically associated with routine review. The access log timestamp aligned with the ethics office server. They had opened the door. I did nothing differently. Greg forwarded another invoice mid-afternoon. Northbridge Analytics this time. $214,000. Expedite, the subject line read. I replied neutrally, processing in standard sequence. Not confrontational, not defiant. Standard sequence. At 4:42 p.m., I received a meeting request from Internal Compliance, confidential, scheduled for Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. The subject line was blank. I accepted without comment. The next morning, I entered the small compliance conference room 5 minutes early. 2 people were present, a senior ethics officer and an external audit liaison, calm, professional, no accusation in their tone. They thanked me for submitting documentation. They asked structured questions. How long have you observed these variances? Did you discuss concerns internally prior to reporting? Have you retained copies of original source files? I answered factually, no embellishment, no assumptions about motive. When asked what I believed the pattern indicated, I responded carefully. The documentation reflects sustained ledger divergence consistent with intentional redirection of funds. Consistent with, not proof of. Precision protects credibility. They requested the secure transfer of my indexed archive. I provided it through an encrypted protocol. Chain of custody confirmed. Before the meeting ended, the ethics officer said something important. You are not to discuss this with anyone, including your manager, unless instructed. I understand, I replied. Walking back to my desk, the office looked unchanged. Phones rang, printers hummed. Someone laughed near the break room. Greg glanced up as I passed. Everything okay? He asked casually. Yes, I said. And it was true. For the first time in months, my role felt aligned with my responsibility. The machinery began shifting quietly over the next few days. Access permissions to certain financial directories were temporarily frozen for routine system maintenance. An external audit notification was issued bureau-wide under the pretext of annual review acceleration. Greg seemed mildly irritated but not alarmed. Overkill, he muttered during one meeting. Audit season gets earlier every year. I took notes as usual. Silence remained my posture. The difference was this. I was no longer alone with the knowledge. The documentation now lived beyond my control, which meant it could no longer be erased. By Friday afternoon, I noticed Greg logging into directories he rarely touched directly. His usual ease had narrowed slightly. Not panic, not yet. But awareness had begun to ripple. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about allowing the system to reveal itself once pressure is applied. I didn't confront him. I didn't watch him for reactions. I simply continued performing the role they thought I occupied. Dependable, thorough, quiet. The investigation was no longer hypothetical. It was active. And active systems eventually produce consequences. Consequences don't always announce themselves with sirens. Sometimes they arrive as calendar invites. The first visible shift came the following Monday. An all-staff email from the bureau director announced an independent financial process review to ensure compliance alignment across departments. The tone was neutral, routine, preventative, but the wording had changed. Not an annual audit, not a seasonal review, independent. That word travels differently in professional spaces. By midweek, external auditors had been assigned temporary workstations near the finance wing. They didn't introduce themselves broadly. They didn't socialize. They requested files through official channels, including files I had indexed. Greg's behavior changed in increments. He became more hands-on with documentation. He asked for printed copies instead of relying on shared drives. He began CCing the director on previously informal approvals. His language sharpened, less charisma, more procedural emphasis. During a Wednesday meeting, he paused mid-sentence while presenting quarterly summaries. Actually, he said, clearing his throat, we'll defer final reconciliation numbers until audit confirms sequencing. Sequencing, a word he had once used casually, now it sounded measured. No one accused him of anything. No public confrontation occurred, but something intangible had shifted. Colleagues started receiving requests from auditors to clarify past adjustments. Department heads were asked to explain timing differences they hadn't noticed before. I watched confusion ripple gently outward. Utilities couldn't explain why consulting oversight allocations had exceeded projections. Transportation flagged reconciliation timing mismatches that they assumed were clerical. No one yet traced it back to Greg explicitly, but the pattern was surfacing. On Thursday afternoon, Greg stopped by my desk again. Have auditors asked you for anything unusual, he asked, tone light but eyes searching. They requested archived variance logs, I replied evenly. Standard procedure. He nodded slowly. Good, just make sure nothing gets misinterpreted. Context matters. Context? Yes, I said. It does. That evening, I noticed something else. His access permissions had been modified, not revoked, but narrowed. He could no longer bulk apply approval statuses across multiple directories without secondary authentication. Administrative friction had entered his workflow. By Friday, whispers began, not accusations but speculation. Why is the audit so deep this quarter? Did we miss something in last year's reporting? No one mentioned Greg's name. That's how institutions protect stability. They examine systems before individuals. The following Monday, he was called into a closed-door meeting with the bureau director and 2 representatives from ethics oversight. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When he returned to the floor, his smile was intact, but thinner. He gathered us briefly. Just routine clarification, he said. Audit is tightening controls across all departments. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about, but his gym bag remained untouched beneath his desk that afternoon. He didn't leave for his usual external dinner. Consequences rarely feel dramatic to the person who initiates truth. They feel procedural. File freezes, access reviews, extended meetings, formal tone shifts. I felt no satisfaction watching it unfold, only gravity. Because once the investigation deepens, outcomes detach from personal intention. They follow evidence. And evidence had momentum now. Late that week, I received a short, encrypted message from the ethics officer. Preliminary findings corroborate reported discrepancies. Continue normal duties. Further updates pending. Corroborate. The word steadied me. It meant the pattern was visible beyond my documentation. It meant the truth no longer relied solely on my credibility. Greg didn't know yet how much they knew, but the architecture was cracking. And cracks, once structural, don't reseal easily. The tipping point didn't arrive with accusation. It arrived with an absence. On a Tuesday morning, Greg's office door remained closed past 9 a.m. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the silence inside. No calls, no keyboard clicks, no movement. At 9:17, an email from Human Resources appeared in our inboxes. Effective immediately, managerial oversight for finance operations will be temporarily reassigned, pending completion of an administrative review. Temporarily reassigned. Language is designed to calm. By 10 a.m., Greg's calendar had been wiped clean for the remainder of the week. His name still appeared in the directory, but his access to shared financial drives was fully suspended. Administrative friction had become administrative isolation. No public explanation was offered. No announcement of wrongdoing, just procedural adjustments. The office responded the way offices do. Quietly, cautiously, conversations lowered in volume. Doors closed more often. No one asked direct questions, but everyone felt the shift. By midday, the bureau director held a brief team meeting. An external review has identified irregularities in consulting allocations, she said evenly. We are cooperating fully to ensure transparency. Until the review concludes, direct all approval requests through interim oversight. Irregularities, a word that carries weight without detail. I watched the room carefully. Confusion, concern, defensive posture from department heads who had unknowingly adjusted their reports to compensate for upstream distortions. No one looked at me. That was intentional. The ethics officer had been precise. Confidentiality protects the integrity of the process. Later that afternoon, I saw Greg in the hallway. He wasn't escorted out, he wasn't dramatic, but he wasn't the same. His posture had tightened. The ease had drained from his movements. When our eyes met, there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Calculation. He stepped toward me. They're overreacting, he said quietly. Audit always does this when they want to justify their budget. I held his gaze. If the documentation aligns, it will resolve, I replied. Documentation. His jaw shifted slightly. Be careful what you interpret without full context, Doris, he said, voice softer now. It wasn't a threat. It was recognition. For the first time, I saw that he understood the architecture had unraveled. Not completely, but enough. Within days, the review expanded. External forensic accountants were brought in. Vendor registrations were scrutinized. Banking records were subpoenaed through formal channels. The consulting firm's shared registered agent raised flags almost immediately. The supplemental ledger surfaced within audit logs. He could no longer adjust entries retroactively. Access histories had already been archived. The timing had passed. Too late to reconcile. Too late to restructure. Too late to reposition the narrative. 1 week later, Greg's temporary reassignment became formal administrative leave. Still no public accusation. But absence speaks loudly in structured environments. Colleagues processed the shift in stages. Denial. There must be an explanation. Confusion. How did no one notice? Self-protection. Were we exposed? The bureau director sent a citywide memo reaffirming the commitment to financial transparency. An independent investigative summary would be released after legal review. The language was careful. It always is. At home that evening, I sat in silence longer than usual. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only the quiet understanding that the system had reached a point where reversal was impossible. Even if Greg attempted an explanation, the documented divergence patterns spoke independently. The numbers did not require emotion. They required a sequence, and the sequence had been preserved. Too late to fix it. Not because I exposed him publicly, but because truth, once corroborated by multiple sources, becomes heavier than narrative. I didn't know what formal consequences he would face yet. Legal proceedings moved deliberately, but professionally, structurally, reputationally, the arc had shifted, irreversibly. The confrontation happened 2 weeks after Greg was placed on administrative leave. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. I was leaving the building just after 6 p.m. when I saw him standing near the entrance across the street, not inside. His badge no longer granted access. but close enough to watch the doors. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. For a moment, I considered walking past without acknowledgement. That would have been the easier path. But avoidance leaves questions unfinished. I crossed the street. Up close, he looked different. Not disheveled, not broken, just stripped of insulation. Without the office, the authority, the meeting rooms, he was simply a man in a pressed shirt holding a phone he wasn't checking. "Doris," he said evenly. "Greg?" There was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice. "They told me the discrepancies originated in the documentation you provided," he said. "Yes." He studied my face, searching for something, guilt maybe, or anger. "I trusted you," he said quietly. The sentence lingered between us. "I documented what existed," I replied. "Nothing more." He exhaled slowly. "You could have come to me." "I did," I said, "multiple times." That landed, not as a blow, as a memory. He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You know how these systems work," he said. "Funds get moved, allocations get adjusted. It's political." "Political doesn't require duplication," I answered calmly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "You think this ends cleanly?" he asked. "You think they won't protect themselves?" "This wasn't about ending cleanly," I said. "It was about ending accurately." There was a long pause. Traffic moved behind us. The city carried on, indifferent. "I never meant for you to be exposed," he said finally. That was the closest he came to admission. "You position me as a reviewer of actions I didn't authorize," I replied. That exposure already existed. Silence settled again. He nodded once, small, restrained. "I underestimated you," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "I know," I answered. No heat, no triumph. Just clarity. He glanced back at the building across the street, the glass reflecting early evening light. "They're going to make an example out of this," he said. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe they'll correct it." He studied me for a final moment. "You always were thorough," he said quietly. "That's why it couldn't stay hidden," I said. There was nothing left to argue. He didn't threaten. He didn't plead. He didn't confess fully. He simply stood there, understanding that the structure he built had collapsed under its own documentation. "I hope it was worth it," he said. I considered that carefully before answering. It was necessary, not satisfying, not vindictive, necessary. He nodded again, then stepped back toward the curb. "Take care, Doris." "You too, Greg." And that was it. No explosion, no shouting, just two professionals standing in the aftermath of decisions made quietly over months. As I walked away, I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. Confrontation without heat isn't weakness. It's control. It has been 11 months since that evening on the sidewalk. The investigation concluded quietly, as most institutional reckonings do. The public summary cited intentional financial misrepresentation through unauthorized parallel accounting structures. The language was clinical, no theatrics, no character analysis. Greg resigned before formal termination proceedings were completed. Legal consequences moved through separate channels, slower and less visible. Inside the bureau, restructuring followed. Oversight protocols tightened. Bulk approval permissions were eliminated. Cross-department reconciliation now requires dual authentication. Transparency dashboards were implemented for council review. Systems evolve when pressure exposes weakness. I was offered a promotion 3 months after the review concluded. Manager of Financial Integrity and Compliance. The title made me pause, not because I doubted my capability, because I understood the irony. For years, I had been positioned as the quiet validator. Now I was being asked to design the very safeguards that would prevent what I uncovered. I accepted, but with conditions. Clear authority lines. Independent reporting access to the Ethics Committee. Written autonomy over audit sequencing. No ambiguity. The bureau director agreed. My role changed. My posture did not. I still arrive at 8:30. I still bring measured coffee. I still use the same mechanical pencil. But something fundamental is different. I am no longer invisible by negotiation. I speak in meetings now, not more loudly, but more directly. When terminology softens clarity, I correct it in real time. Is that expedited? I ask calmly, or is that bypassed? Precision is no longer inconvenient. It's expected. Some colleagues treat me differently, with caution, with a degree of distance. Whistleblowers are rarely embraced socially, even when validated institutionally. I accept that. Integrity isn't a popularity strategy. What changed most wasn't my title. It was my internal alignment. For years, I believed safety meant staying small. That competence without confrontation preserved stability. Now I understand something more nuanced. Silence is not inherently virtuous. Noise is not inherently brave. What matters is whether your actions align with the truth you can verify. I don't feel proud of the way stories sometimes portray these moments. There was no victory speech, no applause. There was documentation. There was a process. There was a consequence. And there was recalibration. Sometimes I think about the younger version of myself, the 12-year-old who watched her father lose his job for speaking up. I wish I could tell her this. Preparation changes the ending. You cannot control a reaction. You cannot control institutional discomfort, but you can control how thoroughly you stand on facts. I am still quiet, but my quietness no longer negotiates with fear. It rests on structure. When new analysts join the bureau now, I tell them something simple. Learn the numbers deeply enough that no one can translate them inaccurately for you. That's not defiance. It's protection. Who I am now isn't louder. It's clearer. And clarity, I've learned, carries its own authority. If you're expecting a dramatic ending, there isn't one. No courtroom confession scene, no public humiliation, no slow clap from the boardroom, just paperwork and change. The truth is, exposing misconduct rarely feels cinematic. It feels administrative. It feels procedural. It feels like filling out forms while your hands remain steady. People sometimes ask carefully if it was worth it. Worth the tension, worth the isolation. Worth knowing that some colleagues will always associate your name with disruption. My answer is quieter than they expect. It wasn't about being right. It was about being aligned. When I found the double entry books, I wasn't choosing between comfort and conflict. I was choosing between self-trust and self-betrayal. That's the part no one prepares you for. If you see clearly and you do nothing, you don't just protect your job. You slowly erode your own credibility with yourself. And that erosion is silent. I don't believe everyone is required to become a whistleblower. Every situation carries its own risk profile. Safety matters, timing matters, preparation matters. But I do believe this. If you ever hold evidence of something that violates your core values, you owe yourself an honest question. Are you staying silent because it's strategic? Or because it's easier? There's a difference. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about mastering your response when you could react emotionally and choosing structure instead. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I documented. And documentation, when patient enough, speaks louder than outrage ever could. So now I want to ask you something, not as a headline, not as drama, but as a reflection. If you discovered something that could cost you your comfort but restore your integrity, would you wait? Would you prepare? Or would you walk away? I'd genuinely like to know how you would handle it. Tell me in the comments. What would you choose when silence feels safer than the truth?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.